Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Handler from the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I'm going to be giving a quick presentation about climate change impacts across Northwood forests. So, briefly before we begin, I'd like to just introduce the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in case you're not familiar with our group. We are a hybrid organization, a mix of federal and non-federal partners that have come together to form an institute that is really based on delivering practical and scientific information to land managers and foresters all across the forestry community. So we work with anyone and everyone across the forestry and land management community, and we are dedicated to helping people think about how to manage climate change risk and how to adapt while getting your work done. So we're very focused on addressing climate change adaptation in a practical way. You can learn more about us at the website on your screen and also at forestadaptation.org. So across the Northwoods, we are lucky to have a huge array of forest types, whether you're talking about northern hardwoods forests, mixed pine, jack pine sorts of ecosystems, all sorts of conifer swamps and other lowland hardwood forests like black ash complexes. We have amazing diversity in forest ecosystems, and they really define the character of the Northwoods. It's our dominant land cover type. And that is because the climate of the Northwoods, of the upper Great Lakes, for thousands of years has tended to support forest ecosystems. So when you think about the climate of the Northwoods, you think about really strong and long-lasting winters. You think about 4 distinct seasons. Our precipitation patterns are distinct throughout the year, where most of our rain comes during the growing season. So these forests are able to use it. Precipitation in the wintertime is stored as snow and is released gradually as springtime comes to provide additional moisture during the growing season. So all of that together has tended to support a diversity of forest types all across the Northwoods. And so why do we care about climate change and how it might affect Northwoods forests? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, and it really comes down to the different values that we get from these forest types. And so I'm showing just a few of these values here, whether it is the legacy that we're passing down to our children and grandchildren, whether it's wildlife habitat or open spaces, whether it's recreational opportunities for hunting and fishing or clean water that our communities need to sustain themselves. And finally, forestry is a huge economic engine across the Northwoods. Something like over $60 billion in economic output from the forest sector in the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan combined. So we don't have to argue about which of these values is most important. We can all agree that forests sustain us ecologically, economically, and culturally, spiritually. And thinking about climate change, just to drill down on this last point, thinking about climate change is essential for making sure that our forest industry in the Northwoods remains healthy and vibrant and continues to exist. So we need to be assessing risks that are necessary for the forest industry to be able to adapt and cope with change through time, because it's going to take forest management in order to help keep our forests healthy. So we can't have one without the other. We can't have healthy forests without an active forest industry, and we can't have an active forest industry without healthy forests. And so thinking about climate change and the risks it poses to the forests in our part of the world is also vital for keeping this part of our economy healthy. So I'm going to give a quick tour of climate change impacts today. There's more information out there that than I could possibly cover in the time that I have. So if you want to dive deeper, I'd encourage you to check out our series of climate change vulnerability assessments that NIACS has led. Each of these assessments represents a particular forested region across the Midwest or the northeastern United States. You see those different areas shaded in blue. These vulnerability assessments are based on the best available science, so they examine climate change risks across a range of future climate projections. They are not about making recommendations to managers, but they are about providing a common and consistent platform of information. So you have all the information that we know about ongoing and projected future climate change and forest impacts in one place. And they draw information from a variety of sources, including forest impact models, published research, and the experience and local knowledge of managers and experts in each of those regions. So they really are a team-built product. Also, there are great resources available that also provide information for Northwoods forests, including the Climate Change Resource Center and the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, WICI. WICI in particular provides a lot of good climate projections and maps of projected conditions, more than I'll be able to show on this webinar. So, what changes have we already observed in the Northwoods? I'll give a quick tour here. First, let's look at how our temperature has changed over the past century. So I'm showing a change in average annual temperature from 1901 to 2011. And these are, the map you see is scaled in degrees Fahrenheit. And so much of the region has already warmed between 1 and 2 degrees Fahrenheit, with some localized pockets of more intense warming from 2 to 4 degrees warming over the past century, and some areas of localized cooling where the average annual temperature has actually declined slightly over the past century. So it's varied across the landscape, but the general trend is that our part of the world is getting warmer, and this is no different than the Midwest as a whole region or the Eastern United States as a whole. So we're kind of keeping pace with that national average of about 1.5 degrees of warming over the past century. But if we split this up by season and look at how the warming has been different season to season, we really start to see some interesting patterns. Number one is that winter has gotten quite a bit warmer across the region. This is where most of the warming action is happening. So now our most common warming rate is between 2 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit, with many areas seeing above 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer over the past century. Spring is following close behind in terms of the season that has warmed the most. And fall, on the other hand, is a much more muted picture. Some areas warming slightly, some areas cooling slightly. Okay, so there's quite a bit of regional variation in what we've experienced, but again, winter is where most of the fastest warming has occurred. On the precipitation side, this is the general trend in change in inches of precipitation over that same time period, 1901 to 2011. And again, painting with a broad brush, we're looking at slight precipitation increases across the Northwoods. Not great, but between 1 inch and 2 inches generally across the region, with a big area of localized drying along the Wisconsin-Michigan border. And if we break this up by season, we see that summer is where some of the most dramatic changes have taken place. So wetter areas getting wetter, and drier areas getting quite a bit drier, and that dry area centered on the Wisconsin-Michigan border really starts to become noticeable when you look at the summer precipitation in particular. But again, there are areas that have seen a great increase in summer precipitation, like the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. It's not just how much rain we're getting on average, but it is how that rain is being delivered that has changed quite a bit. So this trend is true across the eastern US and really across northern latitudes all around the world. More of our rainfall is being delivered in large precipitation events. So these graphs are showing large rain events of 3 inches or more in one event over the 50-year period from the 60s to the first decade of the 2000s. So this doesn't include any of the major rainstorms that have occurred in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan over the past 8 years. And this trend is expected to continue. And we know that there are severe infrastructure and ecological consequences of these heavy rainstorm events, especially when you get up into the 4, 5, 6, 8 inches of rain at one time. Our natural and infrastructure systems just aren't designed to cope with this much water at once. And unfortunately, these kinds of rainstorms are becoming more and more common. And we have many lines of evidence that plants and animals are beginning to respond to these changes in temperature and precipitation, and that we're starting to see indicators that ecosystems are changing along with the changes in climate that have been observed. So, for example, researchers who have tracked leaf-out dates and springtime phenology over the past several decades have generally observed that spring is shifting earlier about a week over the past several decades, whether you're looking at flowering dates or leaf-out dates or migration dates. And if you're a gardener, or if you have planted fruit trees in your yard, you have probably looked at a map like this that has shown hardiness zones across the country. Hardiness zones are defined by the coldest temperature in winter, so they're kind of defined by winter severity. And as winters have warmed faster in the Northwoods and across much of the country, the USDA and other agencies are starting to revise their maps about what can thrive and what can survive in different parts of the country. So much of the Northwoods, in decades past would have been rated at zone 3 and zone 4 in terms of hardiness zones. And in recent revisions of these hardiness zone maps, those zones have shifted quite a bit. Okay, so zone 3 is really retreating to the margin of northern Minnesota. Zone 4 and zone 5 are much more common now across the Northwoods than they were a couple decades ago. So how might these kinds of changes affect our forests in the Northwoods going forward? Well, in that series of vulnerability assessments that I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we had teams of researchers and land managers from different parts of the region, different agencies, different disciplinary backgrounds. They all looked at this similar kinds of climate change information and generally kept coming up with a couple main headlines of impacts that are really important for forests. And so I'm showing you some of the major impacts that we expect for forests in the Northwoods, and I'm going to take you through these one by one. So first we have a longer growing season, CO2 fertilization, increased drought risk, less frozen ground, increased fire risk, species range shifts, and increased stressors. So let's step through these. First, a longer growing season. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that spring has already been advancing and coming earlier in the year as winters have become more mild. This is another way to look at that kind of information going forward into the future. So I'm showing you projections from downscaled climate data from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. This is looking at the date of the last spring frost by the end of the century. Okay, so we're looking out 80 years into the future, and I'm showing you a mild and a more extreme projection to get a sense of the range of projected futures. The way you read these graphs is that the negative numbers mean that that last spring freeze is happening earlier in the year. Okay, so depending on where you are in the Northwoods, we're looking at maybe an advance of 8 to 16 degrees on the left-hand panel, and then maybe 12 to 24 days on the right-hand panel. So we're looking at between 1 and 3 degrees, or sorry, 1 and 3 weeks advance in springtime. Now, a longer growing season has some benefits. That's more time for growth. Trees can grow faster, they can grow bigger. But there are also some potential risks to this. So as spring advances and warmer conditions happen earlier, you can have an early bud break or a loss of cold hardening. And then that can make plants susceptible to another frost event. So let's say we get a warm-up period in March. Trees start to lose their dormancy and start to have that first flush of leaves, and then another frost happens, and that can really set back particular species more so than others. Oaks in particular can be damaged by these late spring frosts. Potential benefit of climate change for many forest types in the Northwoods is CO2 fertilization. And this is the idea that with increases in greenhouse gas emissions as the years go by, we're basically growing plants and trees in an enriched environment. So there's more free CO2 that is accessible to them, that is fuel for their photosynthesis. So they're absorbing CO2, storing it as glucose, which eventually is built into biomass. And this has been demonstrated in long-term research experiments in growth chambers. They've demonstrated that enhancing the atmospheric CO2 does lead to really substantial increases in increased growth and also water use efficiency through time. There are potential limits to this CO2 fertilization effect, so eventually some other limiting factor is going to pop up and kind of close off that increased growth potential. So some other nutrient or water itself will become limiting at some point. And also there is some indications that other stressors or disturbance may start to crop up and compensate for this increased growth. Some of the researchers examining, for example, insect pest leaf consumption in these artificial growth chambers noticed that bugs started eating the leaves of these trees that were grown in artificial CO2 faster and started consuming more leaf material. So there's this potential that pests and diseases may, may eat into some of that growth benefit. Okay, another major risk that is not something that we often think about in the Northwoods, I will admit, but it is a concern for the future, is this idea that our forests may be exposed to more drought stress going forward. And so, for example, I'm showing a projection of the percent change in annual maximum 5-day vapor pressure deficit by the end of the century. So again, 80 years into the future, showing a mild and a high projection of change. And you see anywhere from a 20 to a 50 or 60% percent increase in vapor pressure deficit by the end of the century. And this chart kind of illustrates what that means or what that feels like for a tree And the idea on the left is that cooler air can't hold that much water. So there's less moisture demand on plants. So if we're looking at, say, a 50% relative humidity, where about half of the available moisture is in the air to a saturation point, there's going to be relatively minimal draw or vapor pressure deficit affecting those leaves. On the right-hand panel, illustrating warmer air that can hold more water. So even at the same relative humidity, there's going to be more potential water loss from those leaves because there's just more availability to hold that water in the air. And so this is going to draw more water out of leaf tissues and potentially stop photosynthesis if leaves have to close their pores. So this is in a warmer air condition. A couple other things leading to this idea of future drought stress. We know as conditions warm during the growing season, that's going to lead to more evaporation, water loss from soils. As growing seasons lengthen and trees are transpiring for longer periods of time, that will also lead to more water loss from transpiration. Okay, so trees are going to have a longer time to draw water out of the soil. Precipitation projections are mixed. Some models call for slight increases, some models call for slight decreases. Okay, so we'll call that uncertain in terms of how much precipitation is coming in. One thing we are fairly certain about is that more of our precipitation is going to be delivered in intense events. Okay, so heavy precipitation is going to increase as a share of our overall precipitation. That leads to an increase in runoff compared to groundwater recharge. So there's the distinct possibility that our soils are not going to be recharged to the same extent that they have been from lighter or milder rain. So we're looking at all of this adding up to potential drier conditions in forest soils, especially in summer and later in the growing season. Another major risk for forests in our part of the world is that you might have less frozen ground. And we showed earlier a picture of how winters have warmed and become more mild. This is a future projection. And again, mild and a more extreme climate change projection for the end of the century. And this is looking particularly at how common are those nights that get below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And so on the left-hand panel, we're looking at anywhere from 8 to 12 to 16, maybe 20 in some places, fewer nights per year below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Under that more extreme climate change projection, it's up to a month fewer of those really cold nights per winter. Okay, and this is just one of many variables that I could show that illustrate this idea that winters are going to continue to warm faster. In a milder winter with less snow, more winter rain, that just leads to less frozen ground. This is a trend that is already being documented across the Northwoods. Here's a Wisconsin example showing frozen ground over the past several decades. And this has ecological impacts, but it also has practical management implications in that a large proportion of our forests in the Northwoods require frozen ground or heavy snowpack in order for management to occur, in order to protect sensitive soils. So what you're looking here really is a reduced window of opportunity for management. Similar sort of projection for snowfall under a mild climate change projection by the end of the century. There's not a large decline and even a slight increase, say, in the western upper peninsula of Michigan in projected snowfall. That's as there's more open ice on Lake Superior and winter is still cold enough to make snow. That leads to more lake effect snow in the western UP. over on that more extreme projection of climate change, that's where you really start to see the reduced snowfall by the end of the century, where we're looking at, a foot or more reduction in snowfall. Okay, wildfire risk. Again, this is something that is not really on the radar for forest managers in the Northwoods right now. In many parts of the Northwoods, we don't have a really active fire regime, or fire suppression has really been able to keep on top of wildfires for the past several decades. There are some indications that fires may increase in the future due to climate change, because we're going to have these warmer, drier periods during the summer, potentially more mortality events causing fuels that are available to burn. Modelers have also looked at how frequently are we going to have those weather conditions, the atmospheric instability that promotes large fires, and we expect that to become slightly more common of a condition. I'm showing an example of some modeling that has looked at fire weather index values and projecting going forward to see slight increases in fire weather index values across most of the Northwoods. But on the other hand, there are many reasons why this potential increase in wildfire may not actually materialize. That may be because fire suppression is expected to continue, and spring or early summer rain may compensate for drier conditions later on. Many of our fire-dependent forest types in the Northwoods have already experienced ongoing mesification because of fire suppression, so maybe they have species now that don't promote fires. And we're talking about a fragmented landscape, so it's easy to access many of our forested parcels, and so makes fire suppression that much easier. We have a lot of information now about how climate change may affect individual tree species. And this is one I don't have a ton of time to go into all the details here, but there are tools like the Climate Change Tree Atlas that can show you projections of future suitable habitat for individual species like quaking aspen. So they can take current information about where a species lives from FIA data and other sources. They can draw statistical relationships to soils, climate, landscape patterns, land use types that describe why that species lives where it does right now. And then they can redraw those projected maps based on future climate expectations. And so, for example, for a species like aspen, we really don't expect it to lose much suitable habitat under a mild climate change scenario, which you can see in the upper right. But under a high climate change scenario, you start to see the suitable habitat changing quite a bit for quaking aspen and becoming reduced. Now, this doesn't mean that all of the aspen will all of a sudden explode and die in one sudden burst. But what it does mean is that the aspen that remains in these areas where you have reduced suitable habitat is going to be growing further outside its comfort zone and may be exposed to more climate-related stress. So the conditions will be less ideal for aspen. That's what these kinds of maps are telling you. On the flip side, you've got a species like white oak, which is very uncommon in the Northwoods right now, but under a mild and a high climate change scenario, we expect there to be increasing suitable habitat for white oak in the future in different parts of the Northwoods. And again, this is not a prediction that white oak will appear in these places in the Northwoods, but what it does tell you is there may be suitable conditions for white oak by the end of the century if you choose to plant it, or if you choose to encourage it in some way. We have some great individual handouts for different regions of the Northwoods at the URL on your screen. So if you are specifically thinking about northern Minnesota or the driftless area or southern Michigan, we have a handout for your particular region where you can look up tree species individually and see whether they're projected to increase or decrease under a mild and high climate change scenario. Finally, worth mentioning that climate change has the potential to really affect the other kinds of stressors that forests experience, whether we're talking about insect pests, exotic earthworms, invasive plants, forest diseases. In many cases, we don't have models or research that project exactly how these stressors may be affected by climate change. But there is a general expectation that more stressed forests are more susceptible to these kinds of pests. And in many cases, stressors have historically been held at bay by cold winter conditions in the Northwoods. Take hemlock woolly adelgid, for example. That pest is limited by lethal cold temperatures in the winter. And as winters have warmed and are expected to continue warming, we basically see increased opportunity for hemlock woolly adelgid to spread across Michigan and Wisconsin. Here's another example from northern Minnesota that shows how climate change can interact with a pest and lead to more damage. Eastern larch beetle, a native pest in Minnesota, typically goes through historical cycles of population booms and busts, leading to more or less damage to larch trees across the state. But over the past 15 or so years, we have seen a prolonged eastern larch beetle outbreak in northern Minnesota. And this is being driven by climate change. Warmer, longer growing seasons allow these pests now to complete multiple generations within a year. So they're able to really build their populations much more rapidly. And they're not getting the lethal cold temperatures in the winter that would ordinarily knock back those populations. So now we're seeing hundreds of thousands of acres of eastern larch beetle outbreaks across the state. Again, this is a native pest now being exacerbated by climate change. And that really leads to this general idea that we hear from the military, the Department of Defense, and other kinds of strategic agencies. They call climate change a threat multiplier. It may not be the thing itself that leads to harm and change, but it can lead to interactions. So when you look at other things that can cause change in forests, like stress, disturbance, and invasive pests and diseases, like I mentioned, climate change can kind of trigger them or make them interact in new and complicated ways. If you go to those vulnerability assessments for different parts of the Northwoods, you will find different discussions of specific forest types and a discussion of vulnerability for each of those forest types. And I'm just going to take you really quickly through those as a quick highlight. The point is that some forest types will potentially be favored by climate change, where other forest types may really be threatened and may be more vulnerable than others. So some of the most vulnerable forest types that were considered in these climate change vulnerability assessments, again, this is a discussion between researchers, managers, a panel of experts in each place. These are the kinds of forests that came out with the highest vulnerability. So our boreal conifers, our lowland conifer systems. Here in the yellow and green, you see forest types that had moderate climate change vulnerability. So some of our more fire-dependent forest types, the red pines, jack pines, and also northern hardwoods tended to fall in this moderate vulnerability camp because of diversity and potential to expand in some areas as boreal forests retract. And then finally, in the blue, some of our lowest rated forest types in terms of climate change vulnerability. So maybe more promising conditions for these kinds of forests going forward across the Northwoods. And you see oaks, barrens, white pine, and floodplain forests, which typically contain more temperate or southern tree species. And again, it's worth mentioning that this is painting with a very broad brush in terms of our general expectations across the Northwoods. So I'm describing some very broad trends and expectations, but we know clearly that local site conditions and management decisions are really going to tip the scales in terms of whether a particular area is more or less vulnerable to change. So an individual landowner or a forest manager really needs to consider what is unique and different about their particular property or their particular project area that might make a site more or less susceptible to some of these changes. So what is your species composition? What kind of soil are you on? Do you have a north or south exposure? How connected are you to the groundwater? Has your hydrology been disrupted in other ways? All of these kinds of local conditions are really important to think about and will help guide you in terms of really making a more precise determination of climate change risk. And finally, just as I leave you here, what are we supposed to do with all of this potential change? How are we supposed to cope with this? How are we supposed to keep our forests healthy in light of climate change in the Northwoods? And we really only have one choice, and that is to adapt. You'll learn more about adaptation from other resources later on. The point is that adaptation should be a way to continue meeting your goals, and that your fundamental priorities and values that you expect and that you rely on from your forests should really drive your adaptation decisions. Okay, so climate change adaptation should be a way to continue trying to sustain these values and priorities going forward. That's where I'll leave you right now. This has been a very quick tour of climate change impacts across the Northwoods. Please feel free to get in touch with any questions you have. My email address and phone number are on the screen. And please visit our website, forestadaptation.org, to get a lot more information about this topic. Thank you very much.